Summer 1943, the Eastern Front. Hitler's planning the biggest tank battle in history. Operation Citadel. 500,000 men, 3,000 tanks. The goal? Crush the Soviet salient at Kursk, turn the tide of the war. But here's the thing. Stalin knew. He knew everything. The date, the time, the exact positions, every single detail of Hitler's master plan. And that's what we're talking about today. Not just the battle, but how the Soviets won it before the first shot was fired. Through spies, through codebreakers, through an intelligence operation so complete, so thorough, that the Germans never had a chance. You see, we always hear about Kursk as this massive tank battle, the thunder of steel, Tigers versus T-34s. And yeah, that happened. But the real victory, it was won in the shadows, by people you've never heard of. Let me take you back a bit. To understand Kursk, you need to understand where Germany was in 1943. They'd been stopped at Stalingrad, pushed back. For the first time since 1941, they were on the defensive. Hitler needed a victory, something big, something that would shock the world, stabilize the Eastern Front, maybe even force Stalin to negotiate. His generals found the perfect target: Kursk. Picture the map. The Soviet lines bulge westward around Kursk. A salient, a massive bulge about 150 miles wide, 100 miles deep. It's vulnerable. Attack from north and south. Pinch it off. Trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Classic pincer movement. The Germans named it Operation Citadel, and they poured everything into it. Brand new tanks. The Pamford, the Ferdinand, Tigers with 88mm guns that could kill a T-34 from a mile away. Elite divisions, the best troops Germany still had. They planned to attack in May, then June. They kept delaying, waiting for more Panthers to arrive, more training, perfect conditions. And every day they delayed, every single day, Stalin learned more. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Soviets had multiple intelligence sources. Not just one, multiple streams, all confirming the same thing. It was like having 3 witnesses to a crime, all telling the same story. First, there was the Lucy spy ring, based in Switzerland, run by a guy named Rudolf Roessler. He had sources inside German high command, real sources, officers who fed him information. The Lucy ring sent messages to Moscow almost daily, details about German divisions, equipment, plans. Roessler's main contact was codenamed Werther. To this day, nobody knows for sure who Werther was. Some think it was multiple people. But whoever he was, Werther had access, top-level access. He told Moscow about Citadel in April, gave them unit numbers, commanders' names, objective maps, everything. Everything. Then there was the British. They'd broken the German Enigma code. You've heard of Bletchley Park, right? Those brilliant mathematicians and codebreakers. They were reading German military communications. Churchill made a decision. Share some of the ultra-intelligence with Stalin. Not all of it. Stalin couldn't know the British had broken Enigma, or the Germans might change their codes. But enough to help. The British passed it through channels, disguised as agent reports. Stalin got detailed information about German tank production, unit movements, even Hitler's personal orders. All from Enigma intercepts. But the Soviets didn't just rely on foreign intelligence. They had their own networks, deep inside occupied territory. Partisans, resistance fighters, regular people who counted German tanks rolling through their villages. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, ran networks throughout Europe. After Stalingrad, these networks went into overdrive. Every German unit movement was reported, every rail shipment, every supply dump. There was also a source called the Red Orchestra, a massive spy network across Europe. The Germans had broken much of it by 1943, arrested hundreds. But some cells survived, and they were feeding Moscow information about Citadel. And here's what's wild. The Soviets also had their own codebreakers. Not as famous as Bletchley Park, but effective. They'd broken some German codes, not Enigma, but other systems, tactical radio communications. By May 1943, Stalin had a complete picture. He knew Hitler would attack Kursk. He knew roughly when, north and south pinces. He even knew which divisions would lead the assault. So what did he do? He prepared the most elaborate defense in military history. And I mean elaborate. Think about it. If you know exactly where and when the enemy will attack, you can prepare perfectly. The Soviets created defensive belts. Not one line, not two, 8 defensive belts. Some places they went 120 miles deep. Trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, all carefully placed. They laid mines like you wouldn't believe. 500,000 anti-tank mines, another 500,000 anti-personnel mines. The Germans would have to fight through a minefield 50 miles deep in some sectors. They positioned artillery by the thousand, concentrated in killing zones where Soviet intelligence said the Germans would attack. They pre-registered targets, meaning they'd already calculated the exact coordinates for their guns. And they moved in reserves, entire tank armies. The 5th Guards Tank Army, the 5th Tank Army, kept back, ready to counterattack once the German offensive stalled, because they knew it would stall. The man in charge of the defense was Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's best general. The guy who'd saved Moscow, won Stalingrad, and Zhukov trusted the intelligence completely. There's a famous meeting in April 1943. Stalin's office. Zhukov's there, along with other top commanders. They're looking at maps, intelligence reports spread across the table. The debate isn't whether the Germans will attack, it's about timing. Some generals want to attack first, strike before the Germans are ready. But Zhukov argues differently. Let them come, let them attack our prepared defenses, bleed them dry, then counterattack. Stalin agrees, and this is crucial. This decision only makes sense if you're absolutely certain about your intelligence. If you're wrong, you've handed the initiative to the enemy, but Stalin knew. Through June, the intelligence kept flowing. Lucy Ring confirmed the German order of battle. British ultra-intercepts revealed fuel shortages in panzer divisions. Soviet partisans reported tank concentrations near Orel and Belgorod. The Germans, meanwhile, had no idea the Soviets knew everything. They thought Citadel was secret. Sure, the Soviets might expect something, but the details, the exact plans, they thought those were secure. There's something almost tragic about reading German accounts from this period. Officers writing in their diaries about how Citadel will be a surprise attack, how they'll catch the Soviets off guard. They had no clue. The Germans kept delaying. Hitler wanted more Panthers, more Tigers, perfect weather. The attack date moved from May to early June to late June. Finally, July 5th. And every delay helped the Soviets more. More time to dig trenches, lay mines, position artillery, move up reserves. By July, the Kursk salient was the most heavily fortified place on Earth. Here's where the intelligence paid off in a really specific way. The Germans planned to attack at dawn on July 5th. The Soviets knew this. From multiple sources, the exact hour. So what did they do? At 2.5 hours before the German attack, Soviet artillery opened up. Thousands of guns. They hit German assembly areas, tank formations, artillery positions. The Germans were shocked. How did the Soviets know? How did they know to bombard those exact locations at that exact time? Some German units lost 10 to 15% of their strength before they even started their attack. But the Germans attacked anyway. At 5:30 a.m., Operation Citadel began. In the north, the 9th Army under General Model. In the south, the 4th Panzer Army under General Hotz. The pincers started closing, and they ran straight into prepared defenses. Minefields that seemed to go on forever, anti-tank ditches, bunkers positioned exactly where they do the most damage, Soviet artillery that had their coordinates already plotted. The Panthers broke down. These brand new tanks, Germany's answer to the T-34, had mechanical problems. Transmissions failed, engines overheated. Some battalions lost more Panthers to breakdowns than to Soviet fire. The Ferdinands, these massive tank destroyers, got stuck in ditches, bogged down in minefields. They had 200 millimeters of frontal armor. Nothing could penetrate them from the front, but they had no machine guns. Soviet infantry swarmed them with explosives. And all the while, Soviet commanders knew what was happening, not just from frontline reports, but from continued intelligence, German radio communications, partisan observations. They knew which German units were succeeding, which were failing. In the north, Model's 9th Army made painfully slow progress. 10 miles in 6 days, losing tanks by the hundred. German soldiers started calling the minefields Devil's Gardens. They'd never seen anything like it. In the south, Hoth did better. The 4th Panzer Army had better troops, better equipment. They pushed 25 miles in the first few days, but they were bleeding, losing tanks faster than they could replace them. The decisive moment came on July 12th, a place called Prokhorovka. The Germans were pushing toward it with their best divisions. If they broke through at Prokhorovka, they might still cut off the salient. But the Soviets were ready. Thanks to their intelligence, they'd positioned the 5th Guards tank army right where it needed to be, over 800 tanks. And on July 12th, they launched a massive counterattack. Prokhorovka became the biggest tank battle in history. Almost 1,500 tanks in an area about 15 square miles. It was chaos. Point-blank shots, tanks ramming each other, smoke so thick you couldn't see 50 yards. Soviet intelligence had even told them about German tactics. The Tigers and Panthers would try to fight at long range, use their superior guns. So Soviet tank commanders were ordered to close the distance, get in close where German advantages disappeared. The battle lasted all day. By evening, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had held the field, technically, but they'd lost their momentum. Their offensive power was broken. That same day, July 12th, something else happened. The Soviets launched Operation Citadel, a massive counteroffensive aimed at Orel, north of Kursk. They'd been planning it for months, waiting for the perfect moment. Hitler had to make a choice: keep pushing at Kursk or pull back to deal with the Soviet counteroffensive. On July 13th, he called off Citadel. After just 8 days, his last great offensive in the east was over. Think about what the intelligence had achieved. The Germans had assembled their best forces, brand new equipment, months of planning, and they'd been stopped cold. Not through superior fighting, though Soviet soldiers fought bravely. They were stopped because Stalin knew everything, every plan, every unit, every objective. The Soviets had prepared defenses exactly where they needed them, positioned reserves exactly where they'd be most effective. After Kursk, the Soviets never stopped attacking. They liberated Kharkov in August, Smolensk in September, Kiev in November. By the end of 1943, they'd pushed the Germans back 400 miles. But it started at Kursk, and Kursk was won by spies and codebreakers before the tanks ever met. The Lucy Ring, British Ultra, Soviet partisan networks, all working together, feeding Moscow the information it needed. You know, it's fascinating. The Germans never really figured it out. After the war, German generals wrote their memoirs, blamed the weather, the equipment failures, Soviet numerical superiority. They never grasped that they'd been completely compromised, that Stalin had read their mail, that every plan, every order, every movement had been reported to Moscow almost in real time. The British kept ultra secret until the 1970s. The Soviets never revealed the full extent of their intelligence operations. Rudolf Roessler, the Lucy Ring spy master, took most of his secrets to the grave in 1958. But slowly, historians pieced it together. Declassified documents, memoirs from Soviet intelligence officers, research in archives. And the picture that emerged was stunning. Kursk wasn't just a military victory. It was an intelligence victory. Maybe the greatest intelligence victory of the war. An entire German offensive, neutralized before it began, because the other side knew everything. Think about the courage it took to trust that intelligence, to build your entire defensive strategy around it. If Zhukov was wrong, if the intelligence was false, the Germans might have broken through, might have changed the course of the war. But it wasn't wrong. Every source confirmed it. Lucy said the attack was coming. Ultra said it was coming. Partisan networks said it was coming. Soviet codebreakers said it was coming, and they were all right. There's a quote from Zhukov after the war. Someone asked him what was the key to victory at Kursk. He didn't mention tanks or tactics. He said, "We knew what they were going to do before they did it." That's the real story of Kursk, not just the battle, but what happened before. The invisible war. The intelligence officers who never fired a shot but won the battle anyway. Rudolf Roessler, sitting in Switzerland, sending radio messages. British mathematicians at Bletchley Park, breaking codes. Soviet partisans, counting tanks in the dark. Anonymous agents inside Germany, risking their lives. These people changed the course of the war. Without them, Kursk might have been a German victory. Hitler might have stabilized the Eastern Front. The war might have dragged on for years longer. But they didn't let that happen. They gave Stalin the ultimate advantage, perfect knowledge. And he used it perfectly. Prepared defenses that the Germans couldn't break, positioned reserves that could counterattack. After Kursk, Germany was finished in the East. Everyone knew it. Hitler knew it, his generals knew it. The only question was how long it would take. How many more battles? How many more lives? The Red Army would reach Berlin in less than 2 years, roll over German defenses that had once seemed impregnable, liberate Eastern Europe, and it all started at Kursk. There's something almost poetic about it. Hitler had built his war machine on surprise attacks. Poland, France, the Soviet Union in 1941, always catching the enemy off guard, always striking first. But at Kursk, there was no surprise. The Germans telegraphed their punches, and Soviet intelligence caught every signal, every hint, every clue, and turned it into victory. You know what I think about sometimes? The German soldiers climbing into their tanks on the morning of July 5th, confident, believing they were launching a surprise attack, about to shock the Soviets. They had no idea that Soviet artillery had already hit them hours earlier because the Soviets knew they were coming. No idea that they were driving toward minefields laid exactly where intelligence said they'd attack. No idea that entire Soviet tank armies were positioned, waiting, exactly where they'd be needed most. The Germans thought they were the hunters, but they were walking into a trap. And the people who set that trap? Most of them never got credit. Rudolf Roessler died in poverty. The British codebreakers weren't recognized until decades later. Soviet intelligence officers vanished into secrecy. But they won the battle. They really did. The tanks and artillery finished the job. But the intelligence services set it up, made it possible. Gave the Soviets every advantage they could possibly have. There's a lesson in here somewhere about the value of information, about how wars aren't just won by the biggest army or the best equipment. Sometimes they're won by the person who knows more. Hitler had better tanks at Kursk. The Tiger was superior to anything the Soviets had. The Panther was faster than the T-34. German optics were better. German guns were more accurate. But Stalin had better intelligence. And in the end, that mattered more. Because he could position his inferior tanks where they'd do the most good. Prepare defenses that negated German advantages. Choose the ground where the battle would be fought. That's what intelligence does. It doesn't just tell you what the enemy is doing, it lets you shape the battlefield. Control the tempo. Fight on your terms instead of theirs. After Kursk, Soviet intelligence kept working, kept feeding Moscow information. They predicted German defensive positions, identified weak points in the German line, helped plan every major offensive from 1943 to 1940. The comedy said that even the power of man is a shame. The intelligence war was won in 1943, and once it was won, Germany couldn't win the military war, not anymore, because they were fighting blind while the Soviets could see everything. Look, the Battle of Kursk lasted 8 days, but the intelligence operation that won it took years. building networks, recruiting sources, breaking codes, learning German procedures. It was patient work, careful work, sometimes boring work, people sitting in rooms, reading intercepts, people walking through occupied territory, counting vehicles, people typing messages in dark basements. Not dramatic, not heroic in the traditional sense, but essential, absolutely essential. Without them, Kursk would have been very different, might have been a catastrophe. Instead, it was a turning point, the last time Germany would attack in the east. After Kursk, they were always retreating, always reacting, never again seizing the initiative. And it happened because Stalin knew, because Soviet intelligence gave him the gift of perfect knowledge, and because he trusted that knowledge enough to base everything on it. So, yeah, the Battle of Kursk was the biggest tank battle in history. Thunder of steel, fire and smoke, brave soldiers on both sides fighting desperately. That's all true. But it was won before the tanks ever met, won by people whose names you've never heard, whose faces you've never seen, who worked in the shadows while others fought in the sun. They deserve to be remembered. The spies, the codebreakers, the analysts, the partisan scouts. They changed history. They helped end the war. They saved countless lives by helping the Soviets win faster. Next time you hear about Kursk, about the tanks and the battles, remember them. Remember Rudolf Roessler in Switzerland, the mathematicians at Bletchley Park, the partisan scouts in occupied Russia. Remember that sometimes the most important victories are won with information, with intelligence, with knowing what the enemy will do before they do it. That's what won Kursk. That's the real story.